You know, we've all heard that saying, history is written by the victors. But what if that's not the whole story? What if to even become the victor, you have to first erase the very people who taught you everything? Well, that is the incredible and frankly chilling story of the Etruscans. So, how do you make an entire civilization just disappear? I mean, this isn't a case of a society simply fading away. No, think of this more like a 2,000-year-old cold case. A crime scene where the evidence was deliberately buried, the victim's voice was completely silenced, and the main suspect? Well, they went on to build one of the greatest empires the world has ever known.
Right. So the first thing we got to get straight is that this was no accident. The Etruscans didn't just collapse. They didn't fade into obscurity. They were made to disappear. This was a deliberate, cold, calculated silence, orchestrated by their single greatest student and eventual rival, Rome.
Okay, so who were these people? Who were the Etruscans that Rome was so desperate to write out of history? Well, long before Rome was, Rome, it was just a collection of huts, a little backwater village, and it existed in the shadow of this much older, much more sophisticated civilization. The Etruscans weren't just neighbors, they were the architects. They were the ones who laid the foundation for almost everything Rome would later claim as its own.
Let's just run through some of the evidence, because it's pretty staggering. You know that iconic Roman arch? The one that's the bedrock of their aqueducts, their Colosseum, everything? Yeah, that was Etruscan. They'd been mastering it for centuries in their city gates and tombs. Rome didn't invent it, they inherited it. Or how about the symbols of Roman power? The fasces, that bundle of rods with an axe in the middle? You've seen it everywhere. It's the ultimate symbol of Roman authority. Well, guess what? It was carried by Etruscan bodyguards long before a Roman magistrate ever laid eyes on it. It was a straight-up copy.
And get this, even the Roman triumph, that quintessential Roman celebration, the big parade for a victorious general with the chariot and the purple robes, it was basically a carbon copy of an Etruscan ceremony. The whole thing was borrowed.
But here's the real kicker. The connection wasn't just cultural. It was political. The last and most important kings who transformed Rome from a village into a city, the ones who built the first forum, the great temple on the Capitoline Hill, the massive sewer system, they were Etruscan. Not just influenced by Etruscans, they were Etruscans. For a critical period, Rome was ruled by an Etruscan dynasty.
So this brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why go to all the trouble to erase your own teachers? Well, it's simple, really. You can't build a world-conquering empire on a borrowed identity. To become this grand mythic legend, Rome needed a pure origin story, a story that started with them. And to sell that story, they had to systematically cut out every mention of the people who had actually guided them in the beginning.
And you can see the two stories right here. On one side, you have the myth that Rome wanted you to believe. Divine twins, Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf. It's a great story, but then there's the reality. A city built by Etruscan kings using sophisticated Etruscan technology. Rome had a choice between the myth and the truth, and they chose the myth. They buried the rest.
So every good revolution needs a catalyst, a single event that pushes things over the edge. For Rome, that moment was a horrific crime, the assault of a noble Roman woman, Lucretia, by the son of the Etruscan king. This was the spark. Her tragedy became Rome's rallying cry. When they rose up and threw out the kings in 509 BCE, it wasn't just a change in government. It was the beginning of a mission to systematically erase every trace of their Etruscan past. And believe me, this wasn't something that happened overnight. Rome was patient. They had a plan. The erasure of the Etruscans was a systematic, multi-generational project. It was like they had a blueprint for how to dismantle a culture piece by painful piece. And it was brutally effective. It basically boiled down to a 4-step playbook. Step 1, you silence their language so no one can read their own history. Step 2, you conquer them militarily, city by city. Step 3, you absorb whatever's useful from their culture and call it your own. And the final step, step 4, you vilify them. You rewrite the narrative to paint them as weak or foreign or corrupt, as people who deserved to be conquered.
And that first step, breaking the link between word and meaning, that was probably the most devastating of all. See, the Etruscan language was unique. It wasn't related to Latin or Greek or anything else around it. By pushing it out of use, by making it a dead language, Rome didn't just mute the Etruscans. They essentially locked the door to their entire world, their history, their beliefs, their literature, and then they threw away the key.
But here's the thing about a perfect crime. There's no such thing. There are always clues. And despite everything Rome did, pieces of the Etruscan world survived. They survived, locked away in the one place the Romans didn't really bother to look, their tombs. And today, modern archaeology is acting like a detective, finally giving a voice back to the victims.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The reason we know so much about how the Etruscans lived is because of how they prepared for death. These incredible necropolises, these cities of the dead, weren't just graves. They were designed to be eternal homes, filled with art, tools, and everyday objects. They're like perfect little time capsules, preserving a snapshot of Etruscan life. And what we found inside those tombs was, for a long time, just mind-blowing. Especially one thing: the status of women in Etruscan society. I mean, look at this. Etruscan women could own property, they were often literate, and, this was the big one, they attended banquets and public events right alongside the men. Now, to their Greek and Roman neighbors, where women were kept largely in seclusion, this was scandalous, utterly immoral. It tells you just how different their whole worldview was. And their spirituality was something else entirely. One of their most famous practices was something called haruspicy, this incredibly detailed art of reading the will of the gods by inspecting the livers of sacrificed animals. They saw the liver as a map of the cosmos. And the Romans? They were totally freaked out by this, but also deeply impressed. They even adopted the practice, but they never quite got the philosophy behind it. For the Etruscans, the universe was a book you could learn to read. For the Romans, it was a force you had to conquer. Now, for hundreds of years, the biggest mystery about the Etruscans was, where did they come from? Ancient writers thought maybe they'd migrated from the east, but just recently, modern science has given us a stunning, definitive answer. DNA extracted from ancient Etruscan tombs proves it. They weren't foreigners. They were native to Italy. And here's the craziest part. Genetically, they were practically identical to their neighbors, the Latins, the future Romans. And that changes everything, doesn't it? Suddenly, the mystery isn't their origin. The mystery is their erasure. These weren't strange invaders from a foreign land. They were neighbors. They were basically family to the very people who would eventually wipe them from the history books. So the real question, the much darker question, becomes, how could you do that to your own people?
So, where does that leave us? What's the final verdict here? The story of the Etruscans, it's so much more than just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a masterclass in the politics of memory. It shows us how history isn't just recorded, it's constructed, it's controlled, and sometimes it's weaponized.
I mean, it really gets to the core of it, right? History isn't just a neutral log of things that happened. It's a story. And that story is shaped and curated by whoever holds the pen, by whoever is in power. What we choose to remember, and maybe more importantly, what we choose to forget, is almost always a political act. And there is no better or sadder example of that than the Etruscans. So in the end, the verdict is this. The Etruscans were erased, not because they were weak or backwards or irrelevant, just the opposite. They were erased because their influence was so profound. Their very existence was a threat to Rome's carefully manufactured identity. It was a constant reminder that Rome's glorious story wasn't entirely its own. It's like, to create their own legend, they had to destroy their own teacher. And that leaves us with a pretty unsettling thought to end on. If a civilization as advanced, as influential as the Etruscans could be so thoroughly scrubbed from the record, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If history is written by the victors, how many other stories, how many other entire worlds have been lost forever, silenced before we ever even had a chance to hear them?